As an introduction to this series of videos, I'm going to do a thing you'll see a lot of my videos coming up soon are going to do. Explain why I'm stealing video concepts from better YouTubers. I've always wanted to legitimately start talking about anime. My favorite set of YouTubers are essentially a part of that crowd. Digibro, Super Eyepatch Wolf, The Pedantic Romantic, Giguk, etc. Basically, all a bunch of huge influences on me. And also, I just love anime. And now that I covered Devilman Crybaby, I figure I'll start throwing my hat in the ring. So, a few years ago, the YouTuber Digibro made a series of videos about the Garden of Sinners movies, a bunch of anime films known for their kind of obtuse structure and stories, gorgeous animation, and excellent Yuki Kajira scores. The reason I found these videos fascinating were the visual elements. While he could have just made a normal review or video analysis using some footage, he made these videos in a much more intimate manner, explaining how each of the films affected him personally, what he got from them, and what his overall takeaway was and how it related to his own life. And conceptually, I really like this idea. And honestly, he's the only one who's done something like that, and the videos themselves are kind of old. So, because I want to make content that, in theory, I'd be interested in watching, I'm basically going to be undertaking a similar venture, because the content of videos like this are wholly dependent on who makes them, especially with odd movies like Garden of Sinners. So I think it's interesting to see how this series, as well as other art pieces in general, affect other people on a personal level. I'll link a video playlist in the description below, because not only do I want people to know what I'm doing, I think seeing other comparisons would be interesting, especially considering I related these films in a way I think is unique. I'm going to be doing this for Garden of Sinners, and of course I have a couple of other series planned in the future as well, because I just need an excuse to go and rewatch a lot of these things. It basically just lets me talk about a lot of things that I love outside the context of pure analysis, being a little bit more stream of consciousness. And not only do I want to do this with anime, I've decided I want to do it with the filmography of some of my favorite directors and, other stuff. So with this out of the way, let's begin. Kara no Kyoukai, known in English as Garden of Sinners, is a series of anime films produced by Studio Ufotable, better known for their Type Moon adaptations like the Fate franchise. Films in this series are, in essence, a series of art films, as well as supernatural horror and mystery films with a leaning towards Lovecraftian sensibilities. These stories were based off a series of light novels written by Kinoku Nazu, and are framed as having the same few characters and different vignettes or stories told out of order. The movies are known for being rather obtuse, so if you're imagining them as being inaccessible and kind of strange, you would be correct, and you'd also be thinking exactly what I was thinking when I was first introduced to these films by Arcada of Glass Reflections more than 5 years ago. However, of course, it wasn't until I saw Digibro's videos that I decided to watch them. Garden of Sinners is a series where my relationship to it is altered over the years simply by having more life experience. The concepts in these films are so personal and specific that being younger didn't lend me the perspective I required to get out of them what I do now. While you may be watching these for my specific take, even though I do recommend all of these films, I urge you to only watch them if you are sincerely compelled to. Unless you enjoy the films of, say, David Lynch, Stanley Kubrick, or Michelle Haneke, I think this series really isn't for you. I don't engage a lot of works the same way I do Garden of Sinners. Most movies are someone sitting down and telling you a story with a combination of sound and images. But with the works of the aforementioned directors and Kara no Kyoukai, it feels not like you're being told a story, but more like you're having an active conversation. Garden of Sinners' Overlooking View is a film about missing parts. It is the feeling of emptiness and loneliness that one gets from isolation and solitude. Every environment in the film, save for Toko's cluttered office, is stark, but it never feels lazy or undetailed. To me, the locations presented in this film are defined by their emptiness and all of its many manifestations. Shiki visits these locations every night, but the shot composition and coloring is never quite the same, so it feels like you're seeing every possible facet of this emptiness. Not only that, but the locations here are in keeping with the kind of character that I think Shiki is. The first thing we're formally treated to in the film is Shiki's apartment, which immediately reminded me of the character of Rust Cole from the first season of True Detective, another character I find myself relating to. Both characters are defined by this rare breed of introspection, an existential loneliness that causes their living environments to contain nothing beyond what is minimally required for them to function as a person. Shiki simply has a fridge full of water, her clothes, a bed, and the strawberry Haagen-Dazs brought to her by Mikia. It was a strange sensation watching this series again, because typically the character I find myself relating to the most is Mikia, but I think as I left high school, I became slightly more defined by my loneliness than by my compulsions, which caused my perspective to shift. Shiki's reluctance to open up at all and bitter annoyance at Mikia's presence resonated with me simply because once you've experienced loneliness of that variety, you become sort of insulated. Anything new is a violation of what is normal, what is safe, so it becomes difficult to adjust to any form of change or alteration. There was a week back in 2016 in my first year of college where I house sat for my uncle. And despite being in that house hundreds of times since I was a small child, I found being in an environment where I was completely alone was far more unnerving than I would have expected. Usually, when I was left alone in my own house, I always had my dog, so it was sort of my first experience in a space in which I was genuinely the only thing that existed. And what came with it is this sort of paradoxical feeling that I get from watching Overlooking View, the feeling of comfort and anxiety. Not only does loneliness seem to exude from Shiki's apartment, but in the buildings she explores as well. It feels like Shiki isn't exactly drawn to such places, but seems to bleed and influence her surroundings to contain less and less life. Shiki is, conceptually speaking, a homunculus of sorts, a soul trapped inside a temporary, fabricated, human-like body. So when she visits Toko and has her arm remade, I always became intensely uncomfortable at the prospect of my own body being just a mere vessel. When she looks and sees the doll that appears just like her, learning that Minkia was captivated by its emptiness, I felt a pang of existential longing that I could never properly pin down until now. I am a very identity-based person. Speaking, I think ourselves, our identities, our souls are what make us unique. But because we can't separate the soul from the body in any way other than theory, the thought of seeing another version of myself is just unnerving. If you can be replicated, then you are not special, you are not unique, and you have no value. And because I'm the type of person that wants to believe that he and every other person has value of individual merit, it's a genuine source of anxiety. I wonder if perhaps Shiki feels the same fear that she may be replicated, but due to her personality, simply just doesn't voice this concern. However, there is always one core theme or idea that leaps out and latches onto me personally with films like this. With Overlooking View, it is the idea of death and suicide. I find it very fitting that this story of wayward spirits, sirens, and death takes place in such an environment. The buildings more like creatively designed corpses than actual structures. It makes it feel all-encompassing, far-reaching, and really communicates the concept of the overlooking view, seeing everything around you, no matter how mundane, right before you jump and fall to your death. That was one part that really got to me, the explanation of the title. The overlooking view is captivating, seeing all that surrounds you and truly taking it in, but the acknowledgement that the mundanity of what you see doesn't really matter and lends this idea depth. Why is such a sight beautiful, even if you aren't really surrounded by things that you would consider beautiful? I think it has to do with the overwhelming amount of space. Everything around you, beautiful or no, has a story and characters. Not all of them well-rounded or even interesting, or even relevant to you, but every part of human civilization has a contained experience in each developed part of it. So in essence, seeing all these locations with their own stories and experiences, regardless of quality or intensity, overwhelms you. You are reminded of how large your loneliness feels, but how small it actually is. When Toko and Shiki converse about what drives a person to commit suicide, I'm reminded that I really don't need to engage in this thought experiment because I've lived it. Back in my sophomore year of high school, a lot of things in my life simply didn't work out, and I was kind of lost in every conceivable fashion. I hadn't been diagnosed with manic depression or bipolar disorder yet, so I was on no medication, and at this point in your life where hormones already rule your emotions, so everything was just kind of confusing and hazy. I won't really go into intense detail, but I can certainly say I empathize with the main villain of this story. Wanting that feeling where your whole world simply just kind of disappears along with all of your problems as you teeter on the edge of life or death, wondering if you'll fly or fall. Whenever things got to a low point and self-harm or suicide attempts were actually something that I indulged in, I remember the distinct feeling of abandoning all logic and reason and acting purely on emotion, and how scary it really is because of how volatile my emotions were. It was a lot like the atmosphere of these films, ethereal, but they exist in a universe where logic is run by emotion, so it easily makes me go back to the time in my life where I was almost one of the girls who threw themselves off of the building, or even Shiki when she becomes possessed. Sometimes, in these scenarios, you simply just don't feel like you're in control. This go-around, rewatching this part in particular, made me realize that being alive after such an experience really was a miracle. I didn't possess the fortitude that Shiki did to cut off my own hand like that, yet she did it without hesitation. The movie's antagonist, Fujo, is someone whose soul is split in two, one residing in her sick, bedridden body, and the other a manifestation of her contempt and malice that her existence is contained to that hospital room in an ailing body. A spirit that compels young girls to join her at the building's rooftop and hurl themselves to the ground because of her faint curiosity that resided in her, to see whether or not her spirit merely floated or actually flew. This is where the pathos of the film really hit me, because even though Fujo's spirit compelled these girls to kill themselves, it wasn't a conscious desire or even a decision at all, merely a side effect of her unfortunate circumstance. Because of my manic and bipolar tendencies, I can recall many times where my brain's logical and emotional sides were at odds with one another, and caused me to do or say things that I didn't mean or intend, which led me to long periods of time avoiding any and all social interaction because I simply didn't want to run the gambit of messing up or doing or saying something that didn't represent me as a person. For a while I was confused. Did my brain's conflicted thoughts represent me? Did I define myself by what I thought because it made me seem better than I actually was? Were my mental afflictions a part of my identity, or were they something that prevented my identity from fully forming? I haven't fully answered these questions since, but I learned that while my actions certainly define me more to others, since people can't obviously know what's in another person's head, but if I surrounded myself with people who really understood that this conflict was complicated, they would likely know who I was better than myself, and I have met many people since that this actually is rung true for. Because I consider myself unreliable, because I too feel as if my soul is fractured or split, I rely on others to define me, which is unhealthy, but it's a dependency I've discovered I can't easily abandon, hence why relationships, both romantic and platonic, so heavily influence how I feel, and led me to be so emotional during my states in high school. As to the question of flying or falling, I always found it funny how the characters debated whether or not the person in question's success or failure was relative. Maybe it depended on time or circumstance, because I always just sort of assumed that was the case. I don't believe people as individuals can be predestined or predetermined to be inclined towards failure or success. I think it's a complex combination of countless variables that all intersect in an infinite amount of different ways. We are all not wholly responsible for our success or failure. The world and others are a key factor as well. In regards to the actual filmmaking and technicalities on a more analytical level, Overlooking View is as tightly made and immaculate as these films get. While I find the weaknesses of this particular chapter mostly reside in how Toko so matter-of-factly explains emotional complexities, along with the pacing that doesn't really allow for a narratively compelling sense of pathos to come in until we meet Fujo, I think the rest is absolutely divine. It features my all-time favorite anime score by Yuki Kajira, an atmospheric and gorgeous soundtrack that adds a plethora of intricacies and personalities. Visually, every shot feels perfectly composed, every movement is fluid yet full of weight, and the color design is absolutely stellar. The way the shots are composed allow for a lot of empty space to surround the characters, almost as if they're added details to their environment. It adds to the thematic core of the film in a way, making you feel like you're less important than what surrounds you. The stark but well-defined dark urban aesthetic is something I've always imagined in my writing. Ideally, when people read things that I write in their heads, I hope it looks like Overlooking View, in some form or another. There are so many memorable shots that, to me, feel as iconic as these things are capable of being. The bloody paw prints from the dog as Shiki approaches the first building, the first time Shiki draws her knife, the single shot of her sitting down to eat the strawberry Haagen-Dazs, struggling intently to eat it with just one arm, the POV shot of seeing the overlooking view when Toko is explaining it to Shiki. All of these visuals have stayed with me in the nearly half a decade since I first saw them. Aesthetically speaking, on a visual level, Kara no Kyoukai is how I would describe my ideal representation of what I love. When I said that Overlooking View was a film about missing parts, I meant that both literally and figuratively. It's about the part of you that feels missing when you are encompassed by loneliness. It's about the loss of something as vital as a hand and how you're forced to deal with it. It's about being lost in something that you cannot fully comprehend. I always feel dumbfounded in the final scene where Mikia dismisses his dream about the dragonfly and the butterfly, because he sort of waves it off, but I think it's what pushes Shiki to, however reluctantly, push herself towards Mikia's companionship because it strikes a chord with her. I find myself wondering, will I be the one who is compelled to push myself towards another, or will I be the incentive for someone else to push themselves? Whatever the outcome, if it ends in filling the void, replacing the missing parts that we perceive ourselves to have, I think I'll be satisfied, split soul or no. So far, it's good to see that these movies haven't lost their luster for me, both creatively and emotionally, so I hope that you'll come aboard my journey as I traverse through not only this series, but others as well.